Lord of Mysteries. My Identities echoes across time chapter 471 to 480. Even though Klein would be heading to the foggy town with the Angel of Secrets to tease little Antigo and beat up Zeratul in 3 days, he didn't plan to waste any of this precious time. First, he selected a lucky pirate as the first marionette of his life. Then, Klein discussed with Lynn and decided to prepare for his first ever time travel experience. The flow of time in the past differs from the present. Based on my judgment, 3 days should be just about enough for a time travel trip, Lynn said confidently. Although he had no prior experience, his tone was so assured that it was hard not to believe him. Plus, we can leave the return token with Danitz. He can quietly go find Blood Admiral's men, and when we return, we can hunt him down, allowing you to gain a new marionette. The one you're using now is just a sequence 7 and good enough as a temporary option. Long term, it's better to grab a wraith, Lynn continued. Klein had no objections to this, but out of caution, he asked, "Are you sure it's okay to leave the token with Danitz? It's not that I doubt his loyalty, I just don't trust his brain." Klein wasn't worried about Danitz betraying them, but the man's incompetence as a hunter made him concerned about the token being stolen or damaged during their absence. "It's fine. The token is just a convenient marker. Even if we lose it, we can still return to this era. The only issue might be where we land. It's a bit random," Lynn mused, thinking aloud. "But we should avoid falling into the sea upon return. After all, we're not on the storm pathway and can't walk on water. How about this? I'll give another token to Catalya. She's more reliable than Little Red," Lynn quickly decided. Klein nodded in agreement. Once the decision was made, Lynn efficiently prepared the return tokens, giving one each to Danitz, Catalya, and even an extra one to Frank for good measure, reminding them all to safeguard the items. With everything in place, Lynn grabbed Klein by the shoulder, and Klein held onto his marionette. Then, the time travel ability activated, locking onto the time when Russell first arrived. The surroundings warped instantly, and Klein's consciousness dimmed as if he were sinking into the deep sea or falling into a dream. Though he had wanted to see what time travel felt like, Klein had no resistance against the sensation and fell asleep. When he woke, he found himself sitting under a tree, leaning against the trunk. Lynn stood nearby, changing his clothes. However, the attire clearly didn't match Russell's era. It resembled something from the 21st century that Klein was familiar with. A white shirt, a black suit, a burgundy tie, and a hollow brooch that looked like a cluster of bubbles. To top it off, Lynn had put on a flashy pair of sunglasses. What the hell? Klein couldn't help but form a question mark in his mind as he saw Lynn finish dressing. Noticing Klein was awake, Lynn casually tossed a set of clothes at him. Klein caught them and found they were of the same style as Lynn's, only in reverse colors. There was even an identical brooch and sunglasses. "Hurry up and change. We're going to mess with Russell," Lynn said, adjusting his sunglasses and grinning. "Remember, we're now agents of the Temporal Management Bureau, responsible for arresting unauthorized time travelers." Klein's mouth twitched. He quickly dressed, straightened his tie, and asked, "Weren't we supposed to play the ring grandpa?" Being a grandpa and working for the Temporal Management Bureau aren't mutually exclusive. Lynn said, completely serious. Besides, he suddenly smiled. "With my ability to time travel and connect with different versions of myself across eras, it's only logical that I establish a Temporal Management Bureau, right?" Klein was silent for a second, admitting to himself that Lynn's reasoning was sound. Given Lynn's powers, it really wouldn't be surprising if he started a Temporal Management Bureau. Though, aside from them, there didn't seem to be any real time travelers. Even though Klein had long since come to terms with this, he couldn't help but feel a slight melancholy. He was snapped out of his thoughts when he felt a hand pat his shoulder. Lynn grinned at him. "Of course, if I do establish the Temporal Management Bureau, you'll be the first agent. How about that?" Excited. "One of the perks is frequent trips to the past to enjoy modern life." Klein blinked, then smiled. His earlier gloom faded, and he joked, "But I'll need to do 24/7 shift, right?" "As expected, our chemistry is unbeatable." Lynn shamelessly nodded in agreement. "Come on, Russell should be awake by now. Let's go fool him." Dash dash dash. Meanwhile, in the Gustav family estate, Russell Gustav had just awakened and was processing the memories of his new body. Russell was baffled. He had been at work just moments ago. How did he suddenly end up here? I can't have just dropped dead, right? Damn, I just bought a house, Russell lamented silently, mourning his recent home purchase for a good 3 seconds before curiosity got the better of him, and he started observing his surroundings. As a young man from the 21st century, Russell was well aware of what transmigration was and had even fantasized about it. So, aside from some anxiety and a longing for his parents, he was mostly excited. Maybe after spending more time in this world, he'd start to miss his old life more, but for now, newly arrived and still in the thrill of it all, Russell was eager to explore the world he had landed in. Though he had gained quite a bit of information from the original owner's memories, there was still a difference between remembering and experiencing. Just as he was about to start his exploration, the light in the room suddenly distorted. 2 men in suits and sunglasses appeared before him. You're Huang Dao, right? You violated the Temporal Management Bureau regulations by traveling without a license. Come with us. End of chapter. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. You're Huang Dao, right? You violated the Temporal Management Bureau regulations by traveling without a license. Come with us. Russell, also known as Huang Dao, heard the man in the black suit speak. He froze in disbelief, completely stunned. What? Temporal Management Bureau. Unauthorized time travel. Wait. Does this Temporal Management Bureau really exist? No, hold on, the point is that I broke the law. Damn, while others begin their transmigration journey as overpowered protagonists, am I really about to start mine by going to jail? At this moment, Russell almost cursed. He looked at the 2 people in front of him, his mind racing with thoughts. Then he shouted, I'm innocent. I don't even know how I transmigrated. Even if it's unauthorized, it's not my fault, right? As Russell shouted, he was actually being cautious, raising his voice on purpose. His original body's memories told him that he was a minor noble, so there should be maids in this manner. Russell's plan was to alert others in the hopes of making the Temporal Management Bureau agents hesitant. However, to Russell's disappointment, even though he shouted loudly, there was no response from outside. It was obvious that no one had heard his sudden outburst. Stop trying to be clever. This space has been sealed by me, no one can hear anything from inside, the man in black sunglasses said with a smile, seemingly aware of Russell's little trick. Ahem. You misunderstood, sir. I was just too agitated, that's why I shouted. Russell's heart sank, but as a seasoned adult who had worked in society for several years, he remained calm and coughed lightly. Let's pretend that's the case, the black-suited man said with a smile. Russell's heart sank further. He couldn't help but glance at the man in the black suit, then at the man in the white suit and sunglasses, who had remained silent. After thinking for a moment, Russell forced a laugh and asked, So, agents of the Temporal Management Bureau, you said I violated regulations by unauthorized time travel. How do you plan to deal with me? Greg, recite the regulations of the Temporal Management Bureau for him, Lynn elbowed Klein. Klein. Wait, does the Temporal Management Bureau even have regulations? You never told me about this. Klein felt a bit flustered, but as someone who could play the fool and endure Lynn's antics, he kept his expression composed and said seriously, the Temporal Management Bureau typically sentences unauthorized time travelers to between 100 and 150 years in prison. 100 years. Russell was dumbfounded. He struggled to speak. Would people not age during their prison time? Of course not. It's prison, not a gift of immortality, Lynn said with a smile. 100 years in prison is exactly 100 years. It's not that heavy a sentence. For many long-lived beings, 100 years is nothing. I've always thought this punishment was too light, but alas, it's what the director decided, and I'm just a small employee who can't change it. He even sounded regretful. Meanwhile, Klein was already using his clown ability to control his facial expressions, fearing he would burst into laughter. On the other hand, Russell wasn't laughing at all. For so-called long-lived beings, 100 years might indeed be nothing, but for him, a normal human with a lifespan of around 100 years, this was devastating. However, your situation is even more special than typical unauthorized transmigrators. At that moment, Russell suddenly heard the man in black sunglasses speak, giving him a glimmer of hope. The man continued, "Your unauthorized transmigration conveniently avoided the disaster that destroyed Civilization E. I suspect you deliberately violated the law to escape your original fate, which increases the severity of your crime." Lynn adjusted his sunglasses, his tone growing colder. "For your situation, the punishment is doubled." Russell immediately felt his heart sink, but then he reacted, staring at Lynn in disbelief. "Wait, are you saying that the civilization one came from was destroyed? You didn't know. Civilization E was destroyed more than 10,000 years ago. The era you're in now is the one that arose from the ruins of Civilization E." Lynn didn't hesitate to reveal this truth, which would have left any transmigrator in shock. Beside him, Klein glanced at him, worried that it might be too much. Telling Russell that Earth had already been destroyed seemed a bit harsh, doesn't it? Klein subtly signaled Lynn with his eyes. Lynn winked back, reassuring him. "Don't worry, better to rip off the band-aid quickly. I'll sweeten the deal soon, and he won't break down." Russell didn't notice the interaction between the two Temporal Management Bureau agents, nor was he in the mood to care. He was already in a state of shock. When he first opened his eyes, he had been excited about transmigrating, thinking he could enjoy his new life and eventually find a way back home. But now, Russell was overwhelmed by sorrow. The Earth's civilization had been destroyed. "Everything I know is gone, even my parents." Russell didn't dare to dwell on it. The thought was too painful, making him feel dizzy for a moment. "So, I was lucky, after all. Although I transmigrated and might be imprisoned, at least I survived." Russell forced a smile that looked worse than crying, his voice trembling. Just then, he heard the black-suited man say, "It seems you didn't intentionally violate the law. For cases like yours, there are provisions that allow you to make up for your mistakes in other ways, avoiding a prison sentence." But that wasn't the key point. The key point was that Russell then heard the man laugh and say, "If you perform well, an accidental transmigrator like you can apply to become a D-class employee of the Bureau." D-class employees enjoy certain benefits, including the ability to bring their family members from their original time period, allowing them to enjoy the benefits of time travel as well. Russell's eyes widened as he looked at Lynn, asking for confirmation. "Are you saying that if I become a Bureau employee, I can bring my parents from the past? But didn't you say Earth's civilization was already destroyed? We're the Temporal Management Bureau. For us, rescuing your parents just before the disaster isn't difficult." Lynn adjusted his sunglasses, smiling as he looked at Russell. "So, what's your choice? Would you rather serve 200 years in prison or work to make amends and someday become an employee of the Temporal Management Bureau?" As a skilled boss, Lynn knew that instead of forcing an employee to work endlessly, it was better to offer an irresistible incentive to keep them motivated. End of chapter. Without a doubt, as a qualified script writer, Lynn's promise was grand, captivating, and irresistibly tempting. Even Klein, merely watching from the sidelines, couldn't help but fall silent for a few seconds upon hearing it. He recalled how the Angel of Secrets had similarly painted a grand picture for him, and suddenly felt a sense of fortune in comparison to Russell. Although Klein had to bear the banner of the Savior, and was occasionally persecuted by Lynn, at least he hadn't been duped to such an extent, right? Mr. Fool wasn't too sure, and in the end, decided not to dwell on it. Russell, on the other hand, was clearly moved by Lynn's promises. His breathing grew a bit more rapid, and without any hesitation, he said, I will actively make up for my mistakes. Please give me a chance to join the Temporal Management Bureau." Russell's reaction was not surprising. Without solid evidence, he wasn't someone easily deceived. However, Lynn's perfect timing and well-coordinated actions were simply too impeccable to resist. Lynn chose to appear right after Russell had just crossed over, a moment when Russell's mind was at its most vulnerable. With a display of supernatural power upon arrival, Lynn instantly intimidated him. Then, By throwing in the possibility of a prison sentence, he successfully redirected Russell's thinking, making it impossible for him to question the authenticity of the Temporal Management Bureau, thereby seizing full control of the situation. In this state, Lynn followed up by revealing the truth behind Earth's civilization's destruction, shattering Russell's previously stable facade. He then told him that, should he join the Temporal Management Bureau, he could possibly reunite with his parents. This series of well-placed moves completely broke through Russell's mental defenses, overwhelming his not-so-clever mind and leading him to abandon all critical thinking. One couldn't help but marvel at Lynn's sheer talent for manipulation. All right, since you've chosen to actively make up for your mistakes, I'll give you this opportunity, Lynn said with a warm and brilliant smile as he looked at Russell. Usually, when an unlicensed traveler who has made a mistake, they only has a few options to atone. Go on. Russell couldn't help but swallow nervously, suddenly feeling a deep sense of unease. The first option is to become an enforcer for the Temporal Management Bureau. Lynn said, extending one finger and smiling. The Bureau doesn't lack high-level combatants, but as a vast organization, we are always open to accepting more powerful fighters. Lynn continued, after all, you can probably guess that not every traveler is as weak as you. Sometimes, we encounter formidable violators who refuse to cooperate peacefully, and we have to use force to subdue them. Those who actively cooperate with their reform can take on some simple tasks, like assisting in the capture of these offenders, or perhaps helping with other missions requiring enforcers. But, Lynn glanced at Russell and shook his head, sighing without saying more, yet implying everything. Russell. He suddenly felt that his so-called weakness had been gravely misunderstood. Even though Russell had mentally cursed Lynn's description of him as weak countless times, as an adult well-versed in life's hardships, he obediently followed his heart and asked, what's the second option? The second option suits you well. Lynn looked at Russell meaningfully, smiling. The Temporal Management Bureau strongly encourages the positive development of civilizations. Although we rarely intervene violently, we fully support individuals from those civilizations in promoting their progress. While you technically belong to a civilization that has already perished, there's a fundamental connection between your former world and this one. In essence, this civilization is a continuation of the old one. Now that you've gained a new identity here, you can take part in this era's development and progress, pushing for change and making the world a better place. Lynn adjusted his glasses and looked at Russell. Given that the era you came from was more advanced both technologically and culturally, you're naturally equipped with a template to refer to. And since your mistake wasn't too severe, with a sentence of only 200 years, your goal to make amends is quite simple. You only need to help this civilization advance to a level comparable to the Industrial Revolution you're familiar with. Lynn's words carried a, you're getting a great deal, expression. It's a simple goal. Someone who made a bigger mistake than you had to not only push for technological advancement but also reform society's class and ideologies, working tirelessly for decades. And then, a timeline shift occurred, erasing all their efforts overnight. But I barely passed my college entrance exams. How could I possibly lead a technological revolution? And what is this, timeline shift, nonsense? That doesn't sound remotely scientific. Russell was dumbfounded. He looked at Lynn, then down at himself, desperately trying to recall the books he had read about steam engines and papermaking. In the end, he could only muster a smile uglier than a cry. Is there a third option? Like many protagonists in time travel novels, Russell wanted to transform into a farming magnate, recreating the technology from his memories. Unfortunately, his memory wasn't nearly that reliable. He wasn't like those protagonists with photographic memories. Although he had read many books on such subjects, he could only remember bits and pieces. He might be able to replicate a few things from his memories, but pushing an entire industrial revolution. That was simply impossible. What could Russell do? He was utterly desperate. The third option is simple. You know lab rats, right? Lynn looked at Russell with a radiant smile. If someone is lacking in both combat prowess and intelligence but still wants to make up for their mistakes, their last option is to volunteer for experiments, as a lab rat. Russell's eyes widened instantly. He stared at Lynn and, after biting his lip for a long moment, cautiously asked, what kind of experiments does the Temporal Management Bureau conduct? Oh, there are many kinds. After all, the Bureau oversees countless worlds, ensuring the safety of numerous civilizations. You know that civilization's progress isn't always smooth, and these days, world barriers are like sieves. Unauthorized travelers can pop up anywhere. You're one of the better ones, some offenders are downright insane. Lynn's expression grew wary as he recalled something, looking at Russell. I once encountered someone who used a virus to turn all living creatures in a civilization into zombies. Although we eventually took him down, the mess he left behind. Yeah, that was honest to clean up. End of chapter. After hearing all this, Russell clearly understood something. He swallowed nervously and stammered, so, this requires volunteers to cooperate with experiments to research an antidote. Exactly. Lynn nodded, looking at Russell's somewhat pale expression and added with a smile, but you don't need to worry. The Temporal Management Bureau has well-established protection policies for volunteers. Every experiment is conducted in a special space, ensuring that even if a volunteer dies during an experiment, the time in that space can be rewound to the beginning of the experiment. So, if you choose to become a volunteer, your safety is absolutely guaranteed. It sounded like a good thing, but Russell's face turned even paler. After all, if time could be rewound, it meant that volunteers could be subjected to experiments repeatedly. If the experiments were harmless, that would be fine, but from Lynn's description, Russell could already imagine how terrifying the Temporal Management Bureau's experiments were. The thought of entering a lab and potentially being tortured repeatedly by these experiments made Russell feel weak at the knees. But thinking of his family and loved ones, Russell suppressed his fear and asked, if I choose the third option, how long would I have to be a guinea pig? That's hard to say. It depends on your contribution during the experiments. If you contribute significantly, it might end in a few months. If not, it could take decades. Lynn pushed up his glasses and, seeing that Russell was clearly scared, couldn't help but chuckle. He suddenly said, personally, I still recommend the second option. Given your experiences, if you become a Beyonder of the Paragon pathway, you'll be able to maximize your advantages. Besides, both I and Greg need to stay in this era for a while to handle some private matters. Seeing that you're actively correcting your mistakes, I wouldn't mind offering you some help. Russell's eyes instantly brightened, and he looked at Lynn like a savior. After organizing his thoughts, he said, thank you so much. I'll choose the second option. The first option was clearly unsuitable for him, and the third option was too terrifying. Most importantly, Lynn had sincerely recommended the second path, which indeed seemed advantageous for Russell. Thus, he naturally chose the second option. Furthermore, after a brief consideration, Russell asked, Sir, could you tell me what a Beyonder of the Paragon pathway is? Yes, this was also a significant factor influencing Russell's choice. Although he didn't know much about what pathway is, he wasn't foolish. Even based on the surface meaning, he could guess that Beyonders might refer to people with special abilities. And those abilities seemed to suit him quite well. You don't know. Oh, right, given your current status, you probably aren't familiar with this era. Lynn seemed to pause for a moment, then slowly explained to Russell what Beyonders were, what the divine sequence was, and gave a general overview of the major churches and secret organizations. So, there really are gods in this world. Russell felt like his worldview was being challenged. He couldn't help but ask, but didn't you say this is a continuation of the civilization one was from? His voice trailed off as he seemed to realize something. Lynn's next words confirmed his guess. How can you be sure that the era you were from didn't have Beyonders? Lynn adjusted his sunglasses, smiled, and said, in fact, Beyonders existed in your era, and you've heard their stories. This time, Russell was truly stunned. With a confused expression, he tentatively asked, those mythological tales. Since gods existed in this world, it wasn't far-fetched to think that myths might be true as well, right? Myths, fairy tales, even the history you're familiar with are full of traces of Beyonders. Lynn spoke the truth. Although in the pre-awakening era, Earth's civilization had fewer Beyonders than now, they certainly existed. Otherwise, how could a fairy tale like Cinderella have inspired the creation of magic by a mystery prior in the hermit pathway? And if Beyonders existed, Lynn found it hard to believe that none of those historical figures in the mysterious world were Beyonders. Lynn silently entertained these wild speculations in his mind, though he showed no sign of it on his face, simply smiling as he said, I have some connections with the god of steam and machinery of this era. I can introduce you to join the Church of Steam and Machinery. The mechanical angel also needs someone to help him digest the Paragon Beyonder potion. You two could complement each other. Anyway, in the end, you'll all work for me. Lynn silently added in his heart. Thank you so much, sir, Russell said gratefully, unaware of Lynn's inner thoughts. No need to thank me. Oh, and no need to call me, sir, just call me Lynn. Lynn flashed a warm and friendly smile and gestured for Klein to introduce himself. Gehrman. Having witnessed how Russell had been misled, Klein remained silent for a moment before uttering a name. His expression looked cold. The main reason was that the fool could barely contain his laughter and had to adopt a cold expression to suppress it. By the way, Lynn suddenly seemed to remember something and looked at Russell seriously, saying, the Temporal Management Bureau has high standards for its employees, especially regarding morality. Things like cheating after marriage are absolutely unacceptable. You're not going to have a problem with that, right? Huh. After persuading Russell and preparing him to report to the Church of Steam and Machinery, Lynn stretched as he and Klein left the Gustav family estate. Looking at Klein, who seemed eager, Lynn said, now that Russell's matter is settled, it's time for us to deal with yours. My suggestion is for you to take on a new identity in this era, something like a reclusive, brooding aristocrat with a complex personality. Maybe even act like a vampire duke. Your puppet can play the role of a loyal servant, and you can spread some rumors to create an atmosphere of terror. Occasionally scaring someone would allow you to play both marionettist and even an early-stage bizarro sorcerer. Klein. Having been an observer for so long, Klein could no longer stay silent. After a moment of contemplation, he couldn't help but ask, I can understand most of that, but what do you mean by a complex personality? Because it's scarier that way. Plus, your fourth identity is supposed to be one with a bad reputation. Lynn innocently spread his hands, then looked expectantly at Klein and added, better to ruin your reputation here than in Backland, right? End of chapter. Look, isn't that the new millionaire who moved into District X? Are you referring to Mr. Dantes? Yes, exactly. I heard from a maid who worked at his house before that there's something a bit off about Mr. Dantes. One night, she got up to use the bathroom and accidentally ran into Mr. Dantes coming back from outside. She swears she saw some red liquid at the corner of his mouth. She must have been mistaken, right? Who knows? Haven't you heard? Lately, people around town have been reporting seeing large bats flying at night. Could it be? At the Trier Domestic Servants Association, two staff members whispered to each other, occasionally glancing toward the distance, their expressions a mix of curiosity and fear. In the direction they were looking stood a gentleman around 40 years old. He had deep blue eyes, with finely sculpted features. Even the slight traces of white in his sideburns added to his charm. Anyone could tell that he must have been exceptionally handsome in his youth. Standing beside him was a young man, no more than 18 or 19. He seemed to have noticed the commotion from the two staff members and suddenly glanced in their direction. A bright, almost radiant smile appeared on his face, showcasing a warmth that even revealed two small canine teeth. However, the young man's smile, coupled with his paler-than-usual complexion and, under the candlelight, the faint illusion of red in his eyes, was impossible to ignore. The two staff members immediately stopped their conversation, too afraid to speak further. There's no need to scare them. Dwayne Dantes, who was, in fact, Klein Moretti under a new alias, had also noticed the whispering staff. While maintaining his smile, he lowered his voice and spoke. I'm just adding to your performance. Lynn withdrew his gaze and looked at Klein, his eyes more orange than red. With a grin, he said, if I don't act like this, how will your vampire duke persona take root? Klein could only offer a helpless smile in response. Yes, though Lynn's suggestion had initially sounded utterly ridiculous, After much thought, Klein had eventually agreed. After all, together with Russell, they had arrived in the capital of the Intis kingdom, Trier, and taken on this new identity, Dwayne Dantes. Of course, the fool had initially been reluctant to adopt such a wealthy persona, as it came with a hefty financial burden. However, Lynn's constant nagging about it being destined for you, and how rumors surrounding wealthy people spread more easily in this era, eventually swayed him. Lynn even promised to cover all expenses during the roleplay. Thus, Klein begrudgingly accepted and took on the alias of Dwayne Dantes. At the same time, rumors of vampires, giant bats, and all sorts of supernatural creatures began to circulate in the city. By the way, this entire arrangement had already been cleared with the Church of Steam and Machinery. Both Lynn and Klein were now members of the church, carrying out special tasks. So, no matter how wild the rumors became, Dwayne had no reason to fear being investigated by the church. Mr. Dantes, this is the 5th batch of servants you've dismissed this month. What exactly are you looking for in a servant? Perhaps if you specified your requirements more clearly, we could assist you better. At this moment, a blonde woman emerged from a room further inside, holding a booklet in her hands. She was also a staff member at the Trier Domestic Servants Association, and her expression was one of concern. I have no complaints about the servants you recommended to me before. Each of them is excellent. It's just that, unfortunately, they don't seem to be quite suitable for working in my household, Dwayne replied with a slight, apologetic smile. Maintaining the persona of a vampire dupe came at a price, one of which was that it often frightened the servants in his home. Additionally, frequent servant turnover was a way to add depth to his character. As a result, the servants at Dwayne Dantes' residence were replaced frequently enough to draw attention. Of course, being a conscientious person, Klein had made arrangements behind the scenes to compensate the servants he scared or dismissed, ensuring they wouldn't be left with psychological trauma. He also made sure they had enough luck to quickly find new employers and that their dismissal wouldn't negatively impact their future. Hearing the apologetic tone in Dwayne's voice, the blonde staff member's demeanor softened. In this era, the gap between the nobility, wealthy individuals, and commoners was vast. It was exceedingly rare for a wealthy person to speak so kindly about servants. So, even though the frequent dismissal of servants was unusual, and despite all the strange rumors surrounding Mr. Dantes, the blonde staff member couldn't help but develop a certain fondness for him. She recommended another batch of new servants. After the recommendations were made, and as Dwayne began to browse through the list of names, the blonde woman couldn't resist glancing at him a few more times. She hesitated before asking in a soft voice, Mr. Dantes, isn't this something your butler usually handles? Why did you come in person this time? Although Intis wasn't as particular about subtlety and etiquette as Loan, where even compliments were tightly controlled, it was still a kingdom with its own customs. Nobles and the wealthy were typically quite particular. Usually, the replacement of household staff was handled by a butler. However, upon realizing that she might have overstepped, the blonde staff member quickly apologized. I'm sorry, Mr. Dantes. I shouldn't be prying into your personal affairs. It's all right, there's nothing secretive about it. Alfred is just handling some matters for me and isn't home at the moment, so I had to come personally, Dwayne said with a warm smile. His voice was deep and magnetic. But because I came in person, I had the pleasure of meeting a lovely lady like yourself, didn't I? The blonde woman blushed instantly, lowering her head and remaining silent. Still, she couldn't help but steal another glance at Dwayne, her eyes filled with a hint of longing. The atmosphere in the Intis kingdom was much more liberal compared to Loan. Here, it was quite normal for a wealthy individual or noble to have many lovers, regardless of gender. In fact, it was said that in Intis, a noble or wealthy person would only be criticized if they had no lovers at all. People would start questioning whether there was something wrong with them. How else could someone be so conservative? End of chapter. As a regular staff member of the Trier Household Helpers Association, the blonde lady didn't come from a poor family. However, for her, if she could really become the lover of the wealthy and generous man before her, it would be a way out. Even if she could only be his lover for a few months, getting a generous sum upon breaking up wouldn't be such a bad deal. In this regard, the kingdom of Intis was indeed very open. Ahem. At this moment, Lynn softly cleared his throat. This sound jolted the blonde woman back to reality, and she no longer dared to look up. She had heard that Mr. Dante's eldest son, Miller Dantes, had spent a long time in Loan and had been influenced by its conservative atmosphere, making him very opposed to Intis, lover culture. He even forbade his father from having any lovers. It was said that during the last banquet Mr. Dantes attended, a countess had taken a great liking to him. However, Miller directly rejected her on his father's behalf, leaving the countess feeling extremely humiliated. Rumor had it that the embarrassed countess even spread word of seeking revenge on the Dantes family, only to break her leg the very next night. As the blonde woman recalled various gossip pieces, she smiled inwardly. As a member of the Trier Household Helpers Association, she was quite well informed in such matters. While the blonde lady's mind wandered in gossip, Dwayne had already selected a new servant and returned the booklet to her. They then discussed when the new servant would report for duty, and soon after, Dwayne and his son Miller left the Trier Household Helpers Association together. Watching them leave, the blonde lady couldn't help but sigh, feeling a bit regretful. Tisk tisk tisk, one compliment and you've already enchanted the poor girl. Mr. Dantes, your charm is something else. Inside the carriage, Lynn casually leaned against the cushions, teasing with a smile. Hearing this, Klein shot him a look of exasperation and gritted his teeth, saying, I wonder who came up with this complex persona. Also, the girl was at most interested in Dwayne Dante's wealth, maybe a little in his looks. How can you say she was enchanted? Klein was very certain about this, otherwise, he wouldn't have given the compliment in the first place. Such compliments were quite normal in Trier. Klein wasn't someone who would play with another's feelings. I wonder who came up with that. Lynn first put on a puzzled and innocent expression, but then spoke righteously. To be honest, in a place like Intis, even if you didn't have such a complex persona, these things would still happen. After all, it's not Loan. Besides, with me here to protect you. I even downgraded myself to be your son for your sake, so what are you still unhappy about? Lynn spoke more righteously the more he went on, until finally, he even became smug. If it weren't for me blocking it, that countess would have dragged you into the bushes at the last banquet. At this point, Klein's expression grew a bit complicated as memories surfaced. If there was one thing Klein had the hardest time adjusting to while posing as the wealthy Dwayne Dantes, it wasn't the extravagant spending, but rather the overly open atmosphere of the Intis kingdom. Especially when Klein first arrived in Trier and infiltrated the circles of nobles and the wealthy, attending a banquet for the first time had been a real shock. Even though he had read about the Intis kingdom's openness, experiencing it firsthand was a completely different matter. All right, no need to be scared. They're just a bunch of crazy admirers after your body. No big deal, we'll be leaving soon. Lynn pretended to pat Klein's shoulder comfortingly. It was true. After fooling Russell, coordinating with Artisan, and sending Russell off to focus on inventions, Lynn and Klein had been wandering around Trier for nearly 2 months with new disguises. Otherwise, the rumors about Dwayne Dantes wouldn't have spread so far and wide. Lynn could feel that this time-space dimension was increasingly rejecting them, so it was indeed time to end this time travel adventure. Hearing this, Klein almost instinctively let out a sigh of relief. He really had had enough of those enthusiastic ladies, and some men, in Trier. In the beginning, when rumors hadn't spread, he would even lock his doors and windows every night to prevent servants from sneaking into his bed. That was one of the reasons the servants at the Dantes household were replaced so frequently early on. One could say that Klein would rather return to fight the Admiral of Blood right now than face the warm attentions of those men and women. He could at least shoot the Admiral of Blood, but what could he do about these admirers? Fortunately, Lynn had created a conservative, cruel, and cold persona for him, which had scared away most of his admirers. With rumors spreading, those who had initially fancied him were now hesitating, giving Klein some much-needed breathing room. Otherwise, he might have abandoned his identity and fled long ago. If nothing unexpected happens, the next time we return here, there should be a small time gap, anywhere from a few days to half a month. So before we leave, we need to tie up some loose ends to make sure your identity doesn't get wasted. Lynn reminded him. I'd rather it be wasted. Klein muttered, though he knew Dwayne Dante's identity was better kept intact. Although the enthusiastic ladies and men were terrifying, the results of posing as Dwayne Dante's were undeniable. His marionettist potion had already been partially digested after just 2 months, and perhaps after a few more trips, it might be fully digested before the end of the year. After making arrangements to give the impression that Dwayne Dantes and his son were leaving Trier for business, Lynn paid a visit to Russell, who was tinkering with steam engines in the Church of Steam and Machinery. He informed Russell that they would be leaving for a while but would return soon, and then he and Klein ended their time travel adventure and returned to their original time. However, they had barely landed and regained their footing when Danitz appeared with a look of desperation, shouting, "Help! Gabriel, Gehrman!" Lynn raised an eyebrow, noticing they were in an alley. Behind Danitz were bloodstains, indicating he had been seriously injured. In the distance, a group of people was chasing Danitz relentlessly. Their appearance confirmed they were underlings of the Admiral of Blood. Ah, finally, special delivery is here. End of chapter. Lynn couldn't help but chuckle when the delivery arrived, while beside him, Klein had already reacted. He swiftly grabbed Danitz, pulling him away from the incoming attack from behind, and threw Danitz towards Lynn. Meanwhile, Klein faced the attackers head-on. Lynn casually tossed a few healing spells at Danitz while sensing something. He glanced towards a certain direction in the air. Seriously. Your opponent should be Gehrman. Why are you bothering a fragile support like me? While speaking, Lynn sighed. The next moment, countless scrolls exploded, unleashing the brilliance of the sun pathway. Just a few steps away, Klein, while engaging Steel Mavati, seemed to have anticipated this. He suddenly retreated a few steps, controlling the wraith and the blood threads attached to Senor's spirit. As a result, the radiance of the sun engulfed the pitiful Admiral of Blood, Senor. The reason things had escalated to this point was quite simple. 3 days ago, after receiving the mission from Lynn, Danitz reported to the Iceberg Lieutenant and began inquiring about the whereabouts of the Admiral of Blood and his subordinates. Unfortunately, Danitz was unaware that his informant had already betrayed him and was now working for Senor. Naturally, his actions were reported to the Admiral of Blood. Due to his familiarity with Danitz's character, Senor correctly deduced that Danitz's actions weren't of his own will. However, since he wasn't aware of Gehrman's presence, he wrongly assumed that Iceberg Lieutenant was behind the move. He had also heard rumors that Danitz had recently been in contact with Star Admiral Catalya, raising suspicion that the two pirate generals were planning to team up against him. But as someone backed by the Rose School of Thought, Senor was both powerful and confident. Rather than retreating, he sought to strike back. Thus, Senor allowed Danitz's actions to continue, even deliberately leaking some of his own information, using Danitz as bait to lure the Iceberg Lieutenant and Star Admiral into a trap. The plan went smoothly, until Danitz the hunter, with a sharp cowardly intuition, sensed something amiss and chose to flee in a panic. Still viewing Danitz as useful bait, Senor didn't immediately capture him. Instead, he allowed Danitz to flee while hoping to see where he would run and if he could catch a bigger fish. And as we all saw, Senor's attempt to fish for prey ended with him encountering not just one, but 2 big fish, Gehrman and Gabriel, who proceeded to bombard him with the brilliance of the sun pathway. Of course, it couldn't be denied that a certain someone had orchestrated most of this in advance. Yes, before Lynn left, he used 008 to write a script regarding the Admiral of Blood. Hence, most of what transpired was within Lynn's expectations. Except for the part where, due to his cowardly instincts, Danitz sensed danger ahead of time. According to Lynn's original script, Danitz was supposed to obediently act as bait until they returned, not prematurely sense danger and get himself involved in the mess. It seems having instincts that are too sharp isn't always a good thing. However, this deviation wasn't completely beyond Lynn's expectations. He had already left a contingency plan on Danitz, ensuring that even if Danitz got himself nearly killed, he would be teleported away at the last second. There was also an automatic healing charm on him. Had they arrived a moment later, Danitz would have been teleported out. Well, This outcome isn't too bad, Lynn muttered as he observed the alley. Thanks to the radiant explosion of the sun pathway, most of the Beyonders from the chained pathways were severely injured. Lynn smiled brightly, fiddling with the charm hanging from his waist, a charm made from blood he had extracted from Ouroboros. Its only purpose was to bring him good luck and curse his enemies with misfortune. At that moment, Lynn cursed all of his enemies with the kind of misfortune that would make them trip over their own feet. The battle ended quickly. While, in theory, Klein as a Sequence 5 Beyander should have been at a disadvantage against Admiral of Blood and his subordinates, Lynn's influence tipped the scales. With Lynn's vast resources and the opening move of unleashing countless Sun Pathway scrolls, Klein managed to restrain Senor. In the meantime, Lynn, being a powerful support, handled the other enemies. Klein then successfully transformed Senor into his newest marionette. With his new marionette, Klein, alongside Lynn, who mostly stayed out of direct combat but constantly buffed and debuffed as if for fun, and Danitz, a Sequence 7 Beyander, completely overwhelmed the weakened heretical Beyonders. Congratulations. Now, you've got a Wraith marionette, Lynn said, clapping like a seal. Thank you. Klein, having just finished feeding his creeping hunger, glanced at Lynn, clearly in high spirits. Senor was incredibly useful. As a Wraith, his abilities perfectly complemented a marionettist, making him one of Klein's most desired marionettes. So, we've actually defeated Admiral of Blood. Still in disbelief, Danitz asked as he recalled how Senor had been hunting him earlier. It seemed surreal that Senor was now someone else's marionette. Of course. What did you expect from a mere Sequence 5? It's not like he was going to be that much of a hassle, Lynn replied, casting a sideways glance at Danitz. With a sudden mischievous grin, he placed a hand on Danitz's shoulder. Now, you've seen the strength of the Church of the Fool. Feeling lucky to be alive. Danitz hesitated, recalling the earlier chase. Oh, by the way, you played a significant role in our success today, so here's your reward, the Conspirer Potion Formula, Lynn said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handing it to Danitz. Danitz's eyes lit up as he took the paper eagerly. Don't worry, I'll make sure to serve the Church of the Fool faithfully. In that moment, all the danger Danitz had faced earlier was forgotten. Although he hadn't been that eager for a promotion before, Lynn had long since tempted him with the prospect of becoming a man worthy of his captain. Lynn's words had swayed the simple-minded, possibly love-struck hunter. Now, with the chance for promotion right before his eyes, Danitz's excitement was palpable. End of chapter. Seeing Danitz in this state, Lynn couldn't help but chuckle. Then, he turned to Klein, who was studying his new marionette, and said, he just sent me a message saying he's ready on his side and can take you to meet an old friend anytime. Do you want to go now? Klein paused for a moment, then nodded. Let's go now. He was equally curious and eager about matters involving the blasphemy slate, Antigonus, and the pursuit of Zeratul. Of course, the most crucial thing was that the fool was actually very curious about what kind of person he would become in the future, as seen from history. Okay, I'll send the message. Lynn made a gesture to Klein, and after a few minutes, he concocted a casual excuse to get Danitz out of the way. Soon, a familiar figure appeared beside them. Let's go. I'll take you to meet your old friend. The Angel of Secrets flashed a faint smile and then tossed something to Klein, a black badge engraved with the symbol of the Evernight goddess. This is the key. The place I'm taking you to is under Amoniz's domain. With this key, even without me, you can enter and exit as long as you have the Evernight goddess permission. The Angel of Secrets briefly explained and then guided Klein to activate the badge, which contained the power of the Evernight goddess. To Klein's surprise, his body quickly faded as if erased by an invisible hand. Meanwhile, nothing happened to Lynn, who simply smiled and waved at him. See you later, Klein. I'll take this time to exchange the pirate heads for bounty money. Klein instinctively nodded, showing no sign of panic. After all, he trusted the Angel of Secrets wouldn't harm him. Indeed, once his body had fully faded, Klein's consciousness went dark. When he regained awareness, he found himself lying on the ground, looking up at a sky filled with pervasive mist. The crimson moon, symbolizing the Evernight goddess, was faintly visible through the fog. Welcome to the treasure ground where seers send wave after wave to their deaths, the Evernight goddess Schrodinger's cat box, and the prison of Antigonus. The Angel of Secrets' calm voice sounded. Klein stood up, rubbing the back of his head, suspecting he had bumped it. He couldn't help but mutter, I can understand the law of similar sequence beyonder characteristics conservation bringing them here for the fool's uniqueness, but what's with the Evernight goddess Schrodinger's cat box? His instincts told him that this description was related to him in some way. You should try communicating with the gray fog, Lynn suggested, smiling as he brushed off non-existent dust from his body. Klein immediately grasped what was going on and tried reaching out to the gray fog, only to find that his usually unimpeded connection was now severed. What is this place? Klein asked, not particularly panicked by the disconnection from the gray fog. The peak of the Hornassus mountain range, once the realm of the Evernight, Lynn explained briefly, his gaze landing on a mysterious and eerie town not far away, as if his eyes could pierce through the layers of buildings and see the dark church at its core. He sighed suddenly and tossed something to Klein. Catching it, Klein found it to be a bracelet made of 7 or 8 gemstones, each embedded in a crystal orb. Every gemstone was inscribed with different symbols. Each of these stones is equivalent to a special charm that allows you to summon a historical projection of your future self. I designed it with an ownership recognition feature, so once you activate it with your spirituality, only you will be able to use this bracelet. Lynn introduced. As one of the top craftsmen, he had considerable skill in creating such items. You can also pre-charge some of your spirituality into the bracelet, so you can activate it with a mere thought. Isn't it convenient? This way, even if you encounter Amon while alone, you can surprise him with a little fool trick. Lynn grinned as he spoke, clearly imagining something amusing. You really have it out for Amon, don't you? Klein internally complained but couldn't help admiring the bracelet. He was already quite taken with it. Lynn, remembering something else, added, oh, and the gemstones can be replenished. Although, apart from me, probably no one else can restore it. So after you've used it up, keep the bracelet and come to me for a refill. Klein's eyes brightened. Of course. Lynn's smile grew wider as he looked at Klein. While the bracelet is free, the gemstone refills will cost you. Klein's smile froze as he asked, how much? 20,000 gold pounds per gemstone. No bargaining, the Angel of Secrets replied cheerfully. 20,000 gold pounds. Klein suddenly felt the bracelet in his hand grow 1,000 times heavier, and he handled it more carefully. Still, he didn't try to haggle, knowing full well that such a unique item was worth far more. In fact, doubling the price would still be reasonable. Though he was certain the Angel of Secrets was intentionally testing his wallet. But where can I get that much money? Oh right, the bounty on Admiral of Blood's crew. They're all notorious pirates. Can I exchange the Admiral of Blood himself for money? He must be worth. No, no, no. A wraith marionette is far more useful than money. Besides, I won't need a gemstone refill anytime soon. By then, I might already be a demigod. Countless thoughts raced through Klein's mind. Though he mourned for his wallet, he knew he would eventually spend the money if needed. Lynn, having successfully teased Klein, continued to control the Angel of Secrets and said, by the way, I recently made some improvements to this little trick. The bracelet you're holding is version 2.0. Version 2.0 includes a non-combat mode for the historical projections. In non-combat mode, the energy consumption is low, allowing them to exist for longer durations. They can defend against lesser threats and switch to the more energy-draining combat mode if necessary. How long they last depends on your spirituality. Lynn explained while looking at Klein, then seriously added. So, you can now summon your future self to protect you with basic defenses. While this town may not pose a threat to me, it's dangerous for you. If I overlook something, you don't want to game over early. Better to be prepared. End of chapter. Klein's lips twitched slightly after hearing the Angel of Secrets' words. For a moment, he didn't know whether to appreciate the angel's sincerity or to criticize his unreliability. In the end, Klein lowered his head, gazing at the beautiful bracelet in his hand. Taking a deep breath, he hesitated only briefly before using his spirituality to activate it. Following the guidance of the Angel of Secrets, Klein tugged forcefully at the air, and a figure appeared before him. Klein stared at the figure he had just pulled out, momentarily dumbfounded. The person's appearance resembled the pre-transmigration Joe Mingrui more than Klein of this era. The clothes the figure wore also leaned more towards the familiar 21st century style, a white shirt and black pants. Huh. Is this really the future me, not the past me? Klein started to doubt if he had pulled the wrong person. The historical projection before him looked too much like Joe Mingrui from before the transmigration, and not at all like the future fool. The Angel of Secrets, however, stared at the history projection that resembled Joe Mingrui, lost in thought. After a few seconds, he suddenly had a moment of realization and said, "I see." "Wait, what did you understand? Could you stop speaking in riddles?" Klein was utterly confused as he listened. He couldn't be blamed for being bewildered, the difference in information was simply too vast. Yet, before Klein could process what was happening, the figure of Joe Mingrui, which had seemed to be in a deep sleep with closed eyes, suddenly opened them. At that moment, the figure's form began to change. A dark, semi-transparent cloak appeared on the figure, and a cold, eerie mask covered its face. Beneath the cloak, Klein vaguely made out writhing, slimy tentacles that seemed to be lashing out uncontrollably at the ground or the air. There was no doubt that this form was incredibly dangerous, especially to Klein, who wasn't even a demigod yet. However, almost at the same moment, the bracelet in Klein's hand began to emit light. This light cast a hazy filter over Klein's vision, allowing him to see those grotesque tentacles as though they were shrouded in a veil. Phew, lucky for you, I anticipated this and added a mythical creature filter function to the bracelet. Otherwise, just one glance at those tentacles would have killed you, the Angel of Secrets said. Klein finally came to his senses. He looked at the angel and asked, "So, he's really the future me. Why does he seem off?" To be more precise, Klein was worried that this future version of him was already on the verge of losing control. Otherwise, why would his mythical creature form be so chaotic? Well, it can't be helped. This future version of you is likely still fighting the celestial worthy in the dream, so his control over his body in the real world is bound to be unstable. Lynn explained, scrutinizing the historical projection before them, a projection that couldn't be called that in the traditional sense. After all, historical projections couldn't replicate singular existences from the age of the mysteries, but Lynn's little trick seemed to have bypassed that limitation. Still, Lynn decided to continue calling it a historical projection. He could faintly sense the connection between this projection and a not-too-distant future timeline. From that connection, he could also detect traces of Klein's dream world. Clearly, Klein, who was usually unlucky but lucky in major events, had once again pulled off something extraordinary. He had summoned the historical projection of a future version of himself who had already ascended to become a half-Lord of Mysteries and was currently battling the former Lord of Mysteries in his dreams. Although Lynn had anticipated that this could happen, he was still somewhat surprised when it actually did. Klein, meanwhile, was completely lost in thought. He could guess that the celestial worthy likely referred to the former fool, but what did fighting in a dream even mean? However, Klein didn't have time to dwell on these questions, because he immediately saw the Angel of Secrets, after a few seconds of thought, reveal an eager expression. In the next moment, he conjured a crystal-clear bubble in his hand and placed it into the Joe Mingrui historical projection's hand, or, at least, one of the tentacles that could pass for a hand. As soon as the bubble made contact with the Joe Mingrui projection, it burst, not disappearing into thin air, but rather being absorbed. Klein then watched in shock as the Joe Mingrui projection's previously lifeless eyes suddenly gleamed with light, as if a doll had been given a soul. Klein could clearly feel the projection glance at him, then at the Angel of Secrets. It opened its mouth as though it wanted to say something. Yet nothing came out. The light in its eyes quickly faded away, and it once again became a lifeless puppet. Tisk, as I thought, it didn't work. Lynn sighed, looking a bit disappointed. He had suddenly thought to use his time-traveling ability to see if he could exploit a loophole and bring the consciousness of the future fool into this timeline for a brief journey. Although the attempt had technically succeeded, it had also failed. The future fool's consciousness had indeed been summoned for a split second, but it had been immediately repelled. Well, it could also be that I'm not skilled enough with this technique yet. Once I've practiced more, maybe it will work, Lin muttered to himself. He glanced at the now docile Zhou Mingrui projection, considering for a moment before conjuring another bubble. Klein, still struggling to process everything. What are you planning to do now? Don't worry, I'm just giving your future self a buff. Dreams are one of my specialties. Lin seemed to have read Klein's thoughts, smiling as he explained. He then pressed the bubble into Zhou Mingrui's hand again. This time, since the bubble was only for buffing the future fool in his dream state, there was no awakening of the historical projection. Alright, go ahead and merge with the projection. You might learn something important once you do. He came here for a reason, after all, even if he didn't intend to leave you these memories. Lin smiled at his companion. End of chapter. But I still maintain my earlier suggestion, don't empathize too much. Although he and you are the same person, your fates diverged a long time ago. Crying due to empathy would be disrespectful to us, your friends, who have worked hard to ensure your happiness. Lin said this, then added, but if you do cry, maybe I won't mind taking a photo to commemorate it. Initially touched by Lin's words, Klein rolled his eyes after hearing this last part and responded, I do mind, thank you. But, to be honest, after Lin's interruption, most of Klein's nervousness dissipated. He glanced at the historical projection of Zhou Mingrui, who obediently closed his eyes. Without hesitation, Klein chose to let him merge with his body. Afterward, Klein felt a brief sense of disorientation. It was an extremely short moment, perhaps a few seconds or even less than half a second. Immediately, he sensed a feeling of loneliness that was both foreign and familiar. This emotion didn't belong to him but came from the fleeting glimpse of the future fool. Klein perceived this emotion and, in a daze, seemed to glimpse another version of his life, one where, like him, he transmigrated but lost everything during the Tingen incident. He was revived by the Saphira castle but could never reunite with his family, embarking on a journey of revenge alone, leaving behind only a bouquet of flowers. During this journey, he met many people and had friends, but because he longed to go home, he was always reluctant to get too close to those around him. He was passively or actively drawn into various conspiracies. Even after his revenge was complete and he should have rested, he uncovered some truths about transmigration, and nearly broke down. With the help of others, he stabilized his mind and was immediately swept into the tide of history, facing the schemes of Augustus. In the end, he was hunted by Zeratul, caught by Amon, and forced to enter the forsaken land of the gods, where he confronted the truth about transmigration. Yet, he had no time to rest or adjust, dragging his exhausted body and soul to shoulder the heavy fate for both the people around him and the world. Even in the final moments, the future fool didn't have a moment to catch his breath, forced into the final battle, falling into slumber, and then struggling against celestial worthy in his dreams until now. Looking back on his life, aside from the relatively lighthearted few months in Tingen, his later years were constantly chasing fate, forced to keep moving forward without a moment's rest, whether for himself, for his family, or for the world. He had to keep going. This was too heavy a memory. Even though Klein only obtained fragments, scattered and incomplete, with much of the critical information blurred, the trajectory pieced together by these fragments was enough to overwhelm the fool with suffocating weight and loneliness. Klein finally understood why the Angel of Secrets repeatedly emphasized not to empathize too much. It wasn't just because of the burden but also because the future fool was indeed him. They were like different flowers blooming from the same branch of fate, but in essence, they were still one person. So, these exceedingly heavy memories and emotions might only elicit a sigh from others, but for Klein, it was as if he had personally lived through them. Do you need a tissue? The familiar voice broke Klein's empathy. He looked up and saw the Angel of Secrets, who had somehow produced a packet of tissues and offered it to him. No, I wouldn't cry over something like this. Klein shook his head, refusing the tissues, though his emotions clearly hadn't fully settled. I just didn't expect this. He had imagined what his life might be like without Lin and the Angel of Secrets' interference, but imagination was still imagination. Only when he truly empathized with his future self did Klein realize that everything he had envisioned was far too simplistic. Fate was far more cruel than he had ever imagined. But your eyes look a bit red. Are you sure no tears will fall? Lynn muttered, seemingly reading Klein's thoughts, then smiled and said, Fate is inherently cruel, but you, my friend, got lucky. You met me, a bug in the system of fate. So, stop feeling so sentimental. If you're so sympathetic to your future self, when you get a chance, you can have Lynn take you to the future. Then, you can help yourself punch Amon in the face in your dreams. Wouldn't that be satisfying? Lynn clapped his hands, offering a very characteristic suggestion. Klein, who was still feeling somewhat melancholic, was instantly silenced by this. He couldn't help but glance at the Angel of Secrets, reluctantly admitting that the suggestion was quite tempting. But didn't you mention before that time travel requires coordinates and that the future is off limits? Klein raised a question. Just because it's not possible now doesn't mean it won't be in the future. Lynn smiled at him, consider it a promise for the future. A promise for the future, really? Is that something you're allowed to say? Klein quipped, but his mood had lightened considerably. After all, his fate had already changed. That lonely future fool was him, but it would no longer be his future. After all, he had a friend who could be considered a bug in the system of fate. Thinking of this, Klein glanced at the Angel of Secrets again and, with a sudden realization, asked, It's not just my imagination, is it? You seem to be getting more like Lynn. The fool clearly remembered that the Angel of Secrets used to be mysterious, often cryptic, with an aura of detachment and divinity. Sometimes, Klein even felt that the angel wasn't a real person but just a puppet. But now, the Angel of Secrets' personality seemed much more lively, increasingly resembling the Lynn he knew. This was inevitable from the start. Lynn showed no sign of panic at this near reveal, smiling as he said, We are one and the same. We will eventually merge. It's our destined outcome. Klein, hearing this, seemed to think of something and asked, Are you referring to just you and Lynn, or does that include all the versions of you across different times? Klein suddenly realized a blind spot he hadn't noticed before. You already know the answer, don't you? All of us, of course. Lynn looked at him and smiled. Whether it's the past, present, or future, every version of me will eventually return to Lynn Soto's. Ah. Thinking of all the versions of Lynn across the eras, each more outrageous than the last, Klein couldn't help but take a sharp breath and furrow his brows, asking, What exactly are you all trying to achieve? End of chapter.